Hi everyone, I'm Tammy Bjelland, founder and CEO of Workplaceless. We help companies improve the effectiveness of their remote workforce by training individual contributors, managers, and executives on how to thrive in a distributed environment. Today I'm going to be talking about how to take remote work from sudden to sustainable. So sudden remote work is what we saw many companies do as a response to COVID-19 in an effort to keep their employees safe, keep their customers safe, and also maintain business continuity. Many companies opted to allow their workforces to work remotely. Fast forward some months later, and those same companies are realizing that remote work works. And many of those companies are now making public announcements about the future of remote work for their companies. So you have on one extreme, some companies saying that their entire workforces will be remote, whether that's in just for the near future, perhaps until the end of the year, or whether that's a long-term plan. You're seeing some companies saying remote is the way for us. Of course, then you have those companies on the other extreme where everybody's going to be reporting back to the office as soon as it is safe to do so. For most companies, though, they're going to be somewhere on that spectrum in between those two extremes. So you're going to have companies allow more people to work remotely, perhaps have more flexible scheduling, perhaps alternate scheduling of when some employees come into the office versus stay at home. And so when you have a workforce of individuals who some are working remotely and some are working in the office, that's called a hybrid workforce. So it's a mix of remote workers and people who are co-located or in the office. And those teams are going to be facing some very, very similar challenges. And these pain points that are unique to remote and hybrid teams are really critical because they could potentially have negative impacts on business outcomes. And when companies make the decision to go remote, they need to be able to do that and know that their business outcomes are not going to be negatively affected. In fact, the ideal case scenario is that business outcomes are actually improved. So whether it's cost savings or increases in productivity, increases in engagement, in employee satisfaction, a business wants to make sure that their decisions, and especially a big decision like going remote in the long term, is one, not going to have a negative impact, and ideally, that they will have a positive impact, that change will have a positive impact on business outcomes. And so there are some specific pain points that we are going to address in this talk today. And then also we're going to be identifying some tools that companies can implement in order to address those very same pain points. Before we dive into some of those pain points, I want to talk about sustainable remote work and what that means. So sustainable remote work means that a company has made a conscious decision to allow for remote work in the long term. And to make remote work sustainable or effective in the long term means that you need three things. You need mindset, so the adoption of managerial and organizational practices that support remote operations and team members. You need infrastructure, so the technological as well as procedural infrastructure. Think equipment, think the apps and tools that you need, as well as a remote work policy and other policies and procedures that you need to have in place to ensure effective remote work. And then capability. So the skills that enable individual contributors, managers, and executives to thrive in a distributed environment. So as you're looking at these three pillars of success for sustainable remote work, I want you to think about which area you see the biggest gaps for yourself personally. Is it mindset, infrastructure, or capability? And now I want you to think about your organization. Which area sees the biggest gap in your organization? Is it in the mindset? Is it in the infrastructure? Or is it in the capability? I want you to think about the answers to those two questions as we go throughout this presentation. Because what I really, really want, what my goal is for you to find something that will help you personally be more successful in remote work, and also something that will help your organization be successful in remote work in the long term. That's really the goal here. Okay, so we have the three pillars of success for sustainable remote work: mindset, infrastructure, capability. So what are some of the reasons that companies aren't successful with remote work? What are some of the pain points or the barriers keeping companies from truly leveraging the power of remote work and making sure that their business outcomes are, one, not negatively affected, and also potentially positively affected? So I'm going to talk about some of those pain points in a second, I promise, but I do want to talk first about how some of these pain points, they're interrelated. So sometimes when we think about a problem or individual problems, we think of them as separate entities, when really they're intertwined. So let's take the example of communication. Communication, and if you don't have the effective communication channels or strategies in place, you could potentially have a much larger issue on your hands. So in a remote or hybrid workforce that doesn't have the right communication channels, could potentially see remote workers especially be disconnected from their teammates. If they don't feel like they're able to connect organically with their teammates, share information effectively, they're going to be disconnected, which then affects their engagement. But not only that, it also affects their access to information and their participation in decision making. And that can lead to a slowdown in productivity. So communication doesn't just affect sharing information in the moment, but it can have lasting long-term detrimental effects if you don't have the proper channels and strategies in place. So that's just one example of a problem that is really intertwined with many other problems. And so when we talk about addressing solutions or identifying solutions that can address those problems, we really need to think of the problems that remote and hybrid teams experience in a holistic way. So instead of just identifying one thing and trying to fix that one thing, really looking at the broader scope of the effects of having a remote or hybrid workforce and creating strategies and processes and policies that are well informed by all of the other experiences that a remote or hybrid team has. All right, so that said, let's dive into some of the pain points that teams do find or do experience when they want to employ remote work in the long term. Since we were already talking about it, I'll address one of the biggest pain points that we see organizations finding when they adopt remote work in the long term. And that's communication. So communication is a huge, huge, huge pain point because when you take people out of the office, it becomes much more obvious where there are communication gaps. Because in teams that rely really heavily on face-to-face interaction and primarily interactions that are organic in nature. So for instance, water cooler chat or two teammates who work side by side, just getting into conversations or discussions and making decisions on the fly. So if you have an organizational culture that really relies heavily on that kind of interaction, when you take those individuals out of the office, it becomes very clear where there are gaps or where there have been gaps in documenting decisions, in making sure that information is accessible to everybody. And so when you take everybody out of the office, you'll find that everyone understands that there are gaps in that kind of shift. But then when you put people back into the office, but some people remain remote, you risk running into that situation where you fall back on old habits. So with remote work in the long term, you want to make sure that you are creating a communication focus and a communication strategy that's going to be consistent, aligned, and transparent among all members of the workforce. So I talk about consistency a lot, and that is really, really key because you want to make sure that that experience and those expectations for communication are the same for somebody who's working from home and for somebody who's working in the office. And one of the tools that we use this internally, and we also use it for teams. So one of the tools that we use is called a communication charter. And this can help teams that are remote and hybrid in nature. This tool helps those teams align on expectations. What channels should we use? How should we use them? How quickly should I respond when something comes at me using one of those channels? What does a non-example look like? Or what does this kind of communication not look like? So this communication charter is something that is really key to making sure that remote work is sustainable in the long term. So this particular communication charter is our Workplaceless communication charter, but we facilitate this for other teams as well. The first thing that we did was we identified what kind of priority levels different communication messages have. Is it urgent? Is it confidential? Is it high? Is it normal? Is it low? And making sure that you define those priority levels, that is a key step that a lot of organizations miss. So make sure that you identify what that means and make sure that you have examples and non-examples. And this was a team effort, and I encourage anyone wanting to implement a communication charter, this needs to be a joint effort. And whether this is decided on by leaders or whether there are team members involved in this, if you have different charters for smaller teams and then the larger organization, that's up to you. However, this is not something that is just created by one person, primarily because that's where we find many of the issues in communication are a result of just one person's interpretation of expectations. And then you have miscommunication, you have misunderstandings, and all of the other fallouts that come when you don't have really clear expectations and then an aligned interpretation of what those expectations are. So we have the priority level, and then we have the different expectations for all of our channels. So we've identified what channels we use and what do we use them for. So we have tasks and action items. We use ClickUp. We use email. And then what tool do we use for meetings? And then asynchronous collaboration as well. What are the expectations for that? And so you'll see that this is documented in a mural. And we found that we really wanted to use the brainstorming function of Mural and how visual it was. And this was a multi-step process for us to do, and it was well worthwhile. So first we came together and we brainstormed all the different channels that we use, the types of messages that we send, and we got clarity on what our expectations were in terms of use of those channels. But we didn't just leave it at that. So you can't just leave the charter and just expect people to understand how to use it and what it means. So as a team, we test on everyone's understanding of what this means. So that means that we used a tool to assess everybody's understanding. So it was basically a quiz where we gave examples, message examples, and had people identify what channel it went in, what kind of priority level it had, etc. So there are multiple steps to making sure that you're aligned on your communication expectations. And it's important to continue to follow up. So it needs to be everybody's responsibility to address where there are gaps, where things are not being met, and to make sure that you can address any issues in future meetings. Another one of the biggest issues that we're seeing right now is when it comes to productivity and performance, teams are struggling with setting and maintaining boundaries. And boundaries are really critical when it comes to protecting your energy, protecting your mental well-being, but also making sure that your team is going to be as productive as possible. And so setting boundaries, disconnecting from work, time management, all of these things are connected. So earlier in this presentation, I talked about how problems are interwoven, interconnected. And really when we talk about engagement, many of the elements of engagement all come down to whether your workforce is supported and whether your workforce has the tools that they need, whether individual capabilities or structures and policies at the team and organizational level. Do they have all of that support that they need to make sure that they are doing their best work, maintaining boundaries and able to be as productive as possible. So one of the solutions that we propose for that particular pain point is a boundaries agreement. All right, and this is an example of a boundaries agreement. This is a template. So at Workplaceless, we facilitate different workshops. This particular workshop is about preventing isolation and setting boundaries. So preventing isolation and burnout is really the purpose of this particular workshop. And one of the activities that we facilitate in this workshop is setting a boundaries agreement. And again, just as with the communication charter, a boundaries agreement is ideally a collaborative effort. And this is so that individuals can talk about their boundaries that they wish to set, but also the team comes together to align on expectations and also identify strategies for how they should address a boundary stretch. So a boundary is, for instance, not checking your email on the weekends. A boundary stretch is when somebody asks you to do something or sends you an email over the weekend with the assumption that you're going to get to it as soon as possible. So what do you do if you've set that boundary of not wanting to answer email on weekends, and yet somebody's asking you to stretch your boundaries? So a team really should come together to identify strategies to address situations like that, because we encounter them every single day. And another reason it's very important for this to be a collaborative joint effort is to make sure that leadership is involved in setting these boundaries and following through. So leadership really needs to model setting and respecting boundaries, because your workforce is going to follow exactly what you do. If a manager says it's great to set boundaries, you can definitely disconnect on the weekends. But if that same manager is sending out emails at all hours and asking for input or asking for responses outside of working hours, that's not respecting those boundaries. So going through this activity, going through this task of creating a boundaries agreement that everyone follows and everyone respects really needs to incorporate all levels of a team. All right, we just finished talking about two of the biggest pain points that remote and hybrid teams face when opting to go remote in the long term. I want you to think about what this means for you. So, of the two pain points that we talked about, communication and boundaries, I'm curious about which of those resonates the most with you. Which of those is causing you the most concern when you think about remote work in the long term? Let's say you had to work remotely forever. Which of those is your biggest concern? And if it's not one of those, I'm curious about what your other concerns are. But of the two, I'd like you to just think about what's the biggest concern you have. And then think back to what we just talked about and identify one tiny action, something tiny, something you can do today to help support remote work in the long term. So what's one small thing you can do to help yourself, to help your team? Maybe it's a manager, a direct report, or a colleague. What's one thing you can do to help yourself or help someone else or your team support sustainable remote work for the long term? All right, so think about that. And I want to thank you so much for your attention. If you want additional resources, Workplaceless has created an entire placeless playbook to help organizations convert or transition from sudden remote work to sustainable remote work. All right, thank you so much again for your attention, and I hope to see you on the internet soon.